Good afternoon here, Esme, and for who is watching, could be good morning or any time. I'm Lucimara Letelier. I'm researching regenerative museums at the University of Leicester, the Museum Studies program, with Green Museum Specialism. I'm interviewing today Esme Ward. She's the director of the Manchester Museum, and I'm proud to say the first woman to hold this role in 128 years. So thank you and welcome to be here.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
That's good. So before we start, let's just rethink about what regenerative thinking theory means. It is a theory of change that empathizes with the idea and the need that we should mind an ecosystem as a whole, including both humans and non-humans. It recognizes the current social and environmental collapse and encourages a design to contribute to Earth regeneration by going beyond sustainability. Regenerative development surpasses sustainable development because it understands that sustainability is no longer possible, given the exhaustion of natural resources. Therefore, regenerative cultures focus on creating adaptable conditions that include restoration, reconciliation, and commitment to applying and perhaps prioritizing living systems principles to our personal and professional lives. Regeneration movement invites us to embrace an eco lens in everything we do. And it's based on an ancient knowledge. It's important, it's not a new thing. It's inherent in indigenous cosmology. It has been translated and practiced in modern life in the last 20 and 30 years in multiple areas and industries through principles and frameworks that support the creation of regenerative societies and regenerative economies. They aim to reverse climate and social collapse, if it's possible, and at the very least, generate resilience, stabilize place to design sustainable futures. And the research that we're doing here is focused on how we bring this theory to the museum's practices. So let's think about the Manchester Museum. The Manchester Museum was closed for redevelopment from August 2021 to February 2023. It reopened, and it's now one of the 5 finalists for the Art Fund Museum of the Year. Great, beautiful journey. During this journey, the museum has also reframed the way it is looking to sustainability and sustainable development in so many ways. So I will start by asking, based on this introduction about regeneration, do you recognize some of these regenerative thinking elements on what Manchester Museum is doing and what it believes? And by doing this reflection, I wanted to reflect what's the potential you think regenerative mindset holds for museums?
Yeah. So, I'm so pleased I'm having this conversation on a Friday afternoon, actually. It's a good reflection on a week. So yeah, absolutely recognise a lot of it. I suppose I'm going to backtrack a little bit if I can. I'm going to actually go back to 1890. So I'm just going to go back to the origins of the museum because I think it's really relevant. So the museum has always been a university museum, but in 1890 it opened its doors as a kind of appeal to the civic spirit and the scientific curiosity and devotion of the townsfolk of Manchester. Lovely, beautiful. But when we actually stop and think about what that museum was, so its roots had been in the Natural History Society and the Geology Society for the city. This was a society where one of the founders, their funding had come through the sale of enslaved cotton. This is an institution that was essentially grew a huge amount in the late 19th, early 20th century, is absolutely a colonial repository of material extracted from all over the world. And ultimately, when you look at the architecture, the original architecture of the museum, it neatly had nature on one side, all of your geology, your natural history, or your herbarium, that's on one side of the building. And then on the other was the human culture side, the cultural side, the ethnography, the archaeology. And actually, that still is, that isn't completely the case, but that still holds. That's still a very clear Western culture. It's absolutely done through that kind of rational lens. And part of our thinking over the past few years, already being developed, but I think increased even more in the last few years, was actually, is that really the world in which we live? So every new display, every new gallery space no longer separates out nature and culture. In fact, there are displays on kinship done, curated through an Indigenous perspective. It's not necessarily taking a Western colonial worldview. In fact, it's very intentionally not doing that. And this sense of how you open up a museum to really bring in other perspectives, non-human, human perspectives, but more widely, I guess for me, a big part of this is thinking what's a more kind of ecological approach to both understanding the museum and indeed our context within the city. So a big part of what we're trying to do is really think through what this museum needs to be for its citizens. And if we think that the backdrop for this is absolutely climate and ecological crisis and breakdown, alongside the issues within a city like Manchester, which are hyper diverse, and this sense of looking for a kind of a sense of belonging in a city of inequalities, that is absolutely central. So what does that mean for our museums if we're working in that context? And for us, I think what that does mean is a real sense of how we open up everything the museum is, how we really start to grapple with how are we equipping people to navigate this world? What does that look like? And that might be shift in the stories we tell. It's definitely a shift in the who's telling the stories, but also maybe expanding our role of what it is we think museums are there for and what they do. So our top floor is home to environmental, educational and social justice charities, because back in the midst of COVID, we brought together a whole range of people across the city and asked them, what do you need? What could we be? What could we do? And they were so clear about what they didn't want us to be, which was brilliant. They were like, don't be a campaigning organisation, please. Actually, what we want is we want you to help us build community, build capacity, tell new stories. We want to use you for that kind of broader good within the city. We want you essentially to become like an HQ. We want you to help us dream and imagine what this future needs to be. Sorry, Lucimara, this is a long answer. But I suppose what I'm trying to get at is it's not a neat answer. It's not a, oh yeah, that resonated over here. Mm-hmm. That sense of, ecology and regenerative, that resonates over in this bit of what we do. It is and has to be across everything, across the sense of what are your own circular economies within the museum around your exhibition making processes. What does it mean for your commercial operations? It's got to be all we do. And actually the sense of the values that drive you as an institution, if you're really honing in on those, and if like me you believe at their best museums can be empathy machines, that's not just empathy and understanding for each other, that's for our world as well. So it absolutely does resonate, and I think we're working through, and to be frank, we're experimenting to try and work out what works for the museum and what doesn't, and on whose terms do we make that assessment.
I do think, I mean, it's a long answer because the issue is complex, but also because the Manchester Museum is doing this cross every activity, every action, so it's fine. But doing the questions, we're going to go through the projects, and I think it's going to have an opportunity for us to go back to this idea. So, for example, you just beautifully explained, which I think I'm going to go through now the second question, which are the 7 regenerative principles. Mm-hmm. One of them is wholeness and nestedness. So the first one you just said, it needs to be a whole. It cannot be fragmented. It cannot be solved the issue by doing one fragment or a piece of it. We are the whole thing. It's integral to that mission. The second thing is the notion of nestedness, is the fact that it is the visitor or the museum worker nested in a city that is Manchester, but nested in the UK, and then nested in a planet which has its global issues.
Yeah.
And I think you touched on this very beautifully. So my next question will bring these other principles, and I want to bring you to a reflection on how the projects reflect these principles. So in the center of what the museum is doing, we can see a great care for social and environmental issues altogether. The vision of sustainability expressed this really well. We are fighting for a fair and sustainable future for life on Earth. And this doesn't bring a distinction between human lives and non-human lives. It's about sustaining life. So the regenerative principles, they bring back the living principles and the living mindset to our work on purpose, because not all museums are intuitively doing this. And they should be natural to us because we are living entities. But we need to be reminded in the Anthropocene area how those principles function on our daily projects. So I'm going to go now explain the other principles. And what I want to ask you is if you can provide examples of projects and initiatives that bring these principles.
Okay.
So I explained the whole, the nestedness. The other one is the potential and the essence, is the fact that this place, Manchester, has a potential. And we tend to look things as problem solving, right? And you said the community inspire us to think about the potential of Manchester. The second is the essence, is the singularity of the Manchester Museum on meeting that potential. The other one is developmental, which means that we are all co-evolutionary participants, and it leaves a legacy of new capacities to everyone who is there. It never ends. Nodes, which means that you choose intervention to specific nodes that we can scale and impact for big things that needs to be changed in the system. And the final one is fields of energy, which is very a sensitive way of thinking that we're not alone in the task, the nature is with us, and there is energy influencing the process. So tell me about a project or some projects that resonate to these principles that you feel and comes to your mind perhaps now.
I suppose an obvious one, and we are right in the thick of it, which is not a bad place to be. On the face of it, it's kind of the most museum-y thing ever. So it's an exhibition, you know, that's what we do, isn't it? So it's an exhibition, it's called Wild. And I suppose it just, I'm going to give a sense of where it started and now where it is and how I think it speaks to a couple of these really clearly. So it actually started about 3 years ago with a conversation a few of us had about rewilding and the sense of kind of nature recovery. And that I'd never seen a really good exhibition about that, but wouldn't that be interesting? So originally it was going to be kind of a show about rewilding. But of course, once we started to really think through what this was, we immediately start to understand that even the notion of wild is a colonial construct, an othering construct, that actually it's not just kind of rewilding, it's that sense of how much what wild means to all of us, what our relationship may be to nature, connectedness to recovery, to all of these things. And actually, do we even conceive of ourselves as in kinship with nature? Is that something we conceive of, or is it always other? And so this whole exhibition actually is not just an exhibition that's on for a few months, it's on for a year, and it's exploring really clearly the subject. What's wild now, looking at these incredible wilding projects all over the world, looking at how people all over the world are making their worlds wilder and for what reasons. But I guess, and that's what you'd expect an exhibition to do. But this exhibition's lasting a year. It's a long time. And actually it's the final space, I think, probably speaks mostly to this, particularly to this kind of developmental focus and this sense of system change. So there is an element that's a big partnership space, and that will evolve seasonally. So it will be a different partner every season who is bringing their thinking and ideas and testing and evolving those specific projects, specific challenges, specific narratives that they really want to develop their thinking and kind of think in public with others. So let's explore that together. We've been working with a really interesting organisation called Fast Familiar, who do a lot of applied theatre work, and actually there'll be an interactive, which is asking you as a visitor to go on this kind of game, exploring how you, by the time you get to the end of the exhibition, how you are thinking through what you might do in the world and your relationship to the natural world. And I think doing that really, really beautifully. And then you are immersed in this whole world, which is wild action now, that is just full of existing projects that surround all of us that maybe we don't know about, that are doing this work, that might be round the corner, on your doorstep, you name it. And this is an evolving space. And so I think part of this is then thinking how you are equipping people through that project space. You're literally equipping people if they want to go out in the world and do this work. What are the tools that you need? So for me, something like that, which on the face of it, it's an exhibition. It will be marketed in parts an exhibition, all of that. But we hope it's this exploratory space where you are really coming away having rethought or had at least an opportunity to really reflect on your relationship to the non-human world, to thinking through what you might do, and to really starting to understand the relationships that exist out there. So I don't know whether that does that, but that's one immediately for me, just because of the evolution that has gone through, is, I think, important, actually.
I think it's so interesting that you touched the point of wild and what does it mean, because there are some initiatives in Brazil of widening the thinking, and the fact that they recognize that philosophers in the past create a separation between the science and the myth, which comes from the ancestor knowledge. And by bringing this together, we can relearn the value of wild, which is not just about creating new vegetable gardens, which is important, but it's just part of the equation. So I think it's so interesting.
Can I give you an example? And I was fortunate enough to go and visit. So one of the case studies within it, for me, really beautifully sort of sums up what this is trying to do. So you walk in and there will be a salon, a painting salon, which is full of what we tend to immediately think of if you live in the UK when you think of wild. So they may be big, wild, huge paintings of wild landscapes, and kind of that kind of classic Victorian vision of wild. That's what wild looks like. That's what we sort of think it looks like, isn't it? And then basically the exhibition intends to unpick some of that and suggest new ideas. And one of them is really focusing in on a cultural revegetation piece of work, incredible place called Newell. So we're in Western Australia. It's the Noongar community. It's Aboriginal-led cultural revitalisation as well as revegetation. It is about healing land and healing people. They are absolutely intertwined. There is no distinction between them. It's extraordinary. And it is absolutely about how, so this is a piece of land that was taken during colonial times from those communities. It was turned into farmland. It was absolutely, it was extracted every last bit of anything from that land. It was disastrous farmland. And about 30 years ago, it was given back to those communities and the Aboriginal Land Council, and an extraordinary man called Rocky Eads started to replant. I mean, hectares and hectares, replant, and then more and more people got involved in replanting. And he'd had a relationship with the youth justice system, particularly the Indigenous youth justice system. That had been Rocky's professional life. And he was very aware that did not work. And what he saw is that in healing the land, this actually was also healing people. So he started to develop youth justice programs on that land. And then he realized that what he wanted is he wanted to bring communities together. So he wanted white Australians and Indigenous Australians to work together. It's really, really beautiful. He developed something called the Bush University that's about this. And the reason I'm saying all of it, this is the story we are telling. Yes, we are telling a story about greater biodiversity within those spaces. We absolutely are. But that distinction between healing land and healing people, there is no distinction. It is the two. And it is about trying to get to the very heart of understanding that. So when you are in Nowinut, they have these brilliant Maya structures, which encourage everyone to come into these structures and have a yarn, to talk, to work through different things, to feel, to have it. They have a fire in the middle, and we will have one of those within the heart of the exhibition. But of course, the material is from around Manchester, so there is just this wanting to try and create spaces, not just to experience that and to really stretch our understanding of what wild might be and our relationship to land and each other, but also create spaces to talk about that and think through what that might mean for us. Does that give a bit of a flavour?
Yeah, I think you kind of enter in the next question, but let's bring it to see if there's another layer, because when you bring healing up front, and I think is the recognition of the sacredness of the wild and the sacredness of the social ecology, because it's kind of understanding that it's much more out there beyond just environmental issues. So social issues is about this fabric of the social. So I want to bring this question, thinking about the museum sector in general. We see a separation between social sustainability and environmental sustainability. On the one side, we see decolonization, inclusion, diversity, repatriation. And on the other side, green facilities, decarbonize operations is so common, not only in the UK, it happens everywhere. We also see museums narratives replicating the separation between nature and humans. At the Manchester Museum, we see a perspective that minds the integration. And the mission says very well, we are committed to building understanding between cultures and a more sustainable world. And in the top floor, the hub for both environmental action and social justice altogether. I was going to ask you, why is that choice in the center? And I think you kind of touched on this, but I want to hear you. What is the potential of this integration to perhaps mind museums to see this work being together? And if there are areas in the museums that you see that this integration, it's challenging and it's not always possible. So
yeah, good question. So I suppose that together, actually, there's a really lovely brief story around this. So when we brought everyone together, and we particularly focused in actually on environmental activists, ecologists, researchers, real focus on kind of biodiversity. This in the context of Manchester losing such a high proportion of green spaces as well, real issues around clean air, that's part of the context. Because we bring those people together, they knew what they didn't want, they knew what they wanted us to be. They also really clearly, and we had a really interesting conversation with them where we said, do you want it just to be all environmental organisations? Already on our top floor, we had been working with, we are a museum, but we are also a registered college for neurodivergent young people. We have Pink College, and they love this. And actually, there are quite interesting conversations about neurodivergence and the natural world. So, which is also something we explore in Wild, but that's a whole other something. So, it's really interesting, this conversation with them where they were saying, actually, God, we don't want it just to be all other environment. This is about our city. Cities don't work like that. They're about people. So we actually need others. We want there to be others who are doing work that aligns with our values, but who actually we've got the potential to work together and learn from. And for us, that was always something we'd really hoped. But originally, we were thinking it would just be kind of educational environmental charities. But of course, you can't have climate justice without also looking at the other inequalities, whether that's racial justice. You can't isolate it. So to me, that seems very, very logical. And if you think about or conceive of that space on the top floor as experimental, as a space that is kind of dreaming, imagining, using what's on the floors below, whether that's collections, whether that's data, whether that's expertise, whether that's engaging with visitors, actually having a wider range of partners on that floor is really important, and means that your thinking is only ever going to be richer and more imaginative. So that's partly why that floor looks the way it does, and also because I and others talked about our mission not replicating that architectural divide that I mentioned, which is you have half the staff working on the understanding between cultures bit and half the staff working on the sustainable world. So that's partly why it's like that. That's really actually much easier to do that within a brand new space. Although it existed. So just to flavour the top floor, there is a greenhouse at the very heart of it. There are lounge spaces, there are classroom spaces, there's a therapy room, because actually we're doing a lot of work with young people as well. And actually that's really clear that there's a need for that. And there are all these co-working spaces and artist studios. So it's very flexible space. Where it becomes much more challenging. So what does that mean in the context, for example, of our vivarium, where we have a live animal collection, we do conservation work, we focus on South America, we work really, really close. We are doing captive breeding, conservation work. What does that look like there? And actually that's something we've set as a challenge to ourselves, and I think is really, I'm really excited how it's shaping that work. So what it looks like, for example, is please sponsor a frog at Manchester Museum, because if you sponsor a frog, yes, a small bit of that money will come to the museum to keep our frogs alive. But most of that money will go to the Panamanian Wildlife Conservation Centre, who are working with communities across Panama in those spaces, working with the people. They are working with those school children in Panama so that they are aware of the harlequin frog, of the challenges of chytrid fungus and more. So actually it's sort of leading us to work, I think, much more in a much more focused way with both the people and focusing in on the people, as well as the taxonomic, scientific side of the work. And the two actually in that case really beautifully coexist. It would be weird to do one without the other. Where it's really challenging is when you look at things like I'm going to be really nerdy for a minute, but when you look at things like your databases and you look at the way you digitize your collections, and that tends to be, it might be incredibly scientific. Well, what room is there within that for the kind of data and information that we might want to include? If you look at our conservation processes, what does this mean? And I give a really, really simple, I think really beautiful story. It means they have to change, by the way. But what it means is that actually they're not really fit for where we're heading. And that means they have to evolve. So if you look at, we return material to Australia, to Groot Island, and we return these small shell dolls. But when we returned these shell dolls to Groot, they gave us a gift at the handover, beautiful gift. And the gift was they had collected and made us some new shell dolls for our collection that were ethically collected. And they gave us these, really beautiful. But they also gave us some new conditions for care. And the conditions for care included our understanding of these shell dolls as living cultures, not solely collections, as belongings. Our language doesn't quite work. And so actually one of the conditions for care is that we would, as a museum, have an obligation for all the time we care for these objects, so this is many, many years, that we take these shell dolls out once a year and we play with them. Those are the conditions of care. Now, that isn't usually what museums do, but actually that may be part of the shift we need to make. I don't know whether you feel I've got down another track. To me, this is all
No, it's beautiful
related.
because, yeah, we're gonna get into this, the whole idea of how you did this repatriation of the objects to the Australian island. And I think we need to go a little bit deeper in that case, which is beautifully done. But just finishing this part that we're talking about the social and environmental sustainability, I also want to bring one thing. Regeneration is a lot about regenerating the social fabric that may lead us to regenerate the environment as a consequence of their deep awareness and restorative relationships among ourselves and among also our inner self. So I want to ask you about the initiatives of the South Asia Gallery Collaborative Curatorship, the Belonging Gallery, and the Prayer Room. Do you think they connect to this regenerative idea of restoring the social fabric that then lead us to think about environmental issues more properly?
It's a really lovely way of putting it. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, I'll be honest, but now you say it, yes. I suppose more widely, the way I tend to think of this is about building the culture you want to live in. And I mean culture in the broadest sense. So if we think about that notion of belonging and what that really means, I think it's such an amazing word. A few years ago, I was in Canada, and actually it's partly where the idea of Belonging Gallery came from. And I was talking with a first ever Indigenous curator, amazing man, Gerald McMaster, in North America. And I was actually having a bit of a moan about the language of museums and how it was very cold and detached and you know, real sense of detachment. And I was talking about, collections and artifacts and objects and other. And he sort of looked at me and went, "Oh yes, yeah, of course that's why we call them belongings." And then I said, "Oh yeah," and he said, "Because it's got the word longing." And he said, "And of course, that material for so many of us has been taken." And I just thought it was like a punch to the gut. And it was really important. And I quite often go back to that conversation. And we've done a lot of work talking to people about, we're in a city of sanctuary. We're a museum of sanctuary. What might belong? When Alexandra Alberta, our curator, started, I said, "Alex, I'd really like you to lead on the Belonging Gallery. Here you are," and handed her like a massive book, 80 pages of all the conversations we'd had with all sorts of different people about belonging. I was like, "Good luck." Do something with that. And so I think more widely, that those prayer spaces, a picnic area that's beautiful, that's had as much love and care thrown into a picnic area as a fancy cafe. Toilets, don't even get me started on toilets. Actually, I think they are all part of engendering a sense of belonging. A quiet room, what does that mean if you really thought through a room that people could just step out of the museum and reflect? That's why there's a therapy room. It in a way, these aren't the gallery spaces, but they are absolutely the museum. And just after I started in early 2019, we hosted an iftar in the museum. And we knew doing the South Asia Gallery, and I'd been talking to the Muslim chaplain, and Islamophobia in Manchester is really, really scary, kind of growing tide of Islamophobia. And he'd been talking about a community iftar that he'd held the year before. And I'd sort of looked at him and I said, am I right? Could we do one in the museum? Is that okay? It's just because everything you've said, it's about a spirit of hospitality, and this is everything, and belonging. This is what we want. And so we hosted this iftar. We had so many people came, and it was the letters I got from people afterwards. I have never seen the word belong or belonging used so much. So people were saying the fact that you've hosted this tells me something about who you want to be and who you want to be in your organisation. And now I feel I belong. I've got the potential to belong. And in a way, all of that sits so centrally at the heart of the South Asia Gallery. It's almost emblematic of all of this. So that idea of opening up who tells their stories and what stories are they telling. And they aren't solely stories which are about cultural artifacts or historic moments. So, you know, you walk around that gallery and you have a really, I think, really incredible story, important stories about environment, framed through thinking about environment in relation to care, but also resistance and also extraction, and also possibility. The Chipko tree huggers through to a whole display of birds from Sri Lanka. And I think it's about trying to open up the conversation all the time about what our collections are for, about what they can teach us, and about the complexity of being human in the world today. Sorry, I'm blathering.
It's so beautiful that by acting regeneratively, by intuition, the conversation flows really well because the principles are all there. So the next question, for example, I was going to bring a quote from the Regenerative Institute that says that belonging to a place, it's a doorway into caring. And the Regenerative Institute, it's an organization that has been working with regeneration thinking on development and neighborhood development, city development for 20 to 30 years now in Santa Fe in the US. They created regenerative practitioners. It's kind of a journey in every different places globally for people to think regeneratively. And I think just by hearing you, all the concepts of the book are based on what you were saying, and it's really good. And of course I spot your leadership, invited you because I can see this happening. I just want to go back to what you said about belonging, which I think it's beautiful. One of the reasons why we're doing regenerative thinking and proposing a regenerative development instead, or perhaps as an evolutionary process from sustainable development, is also an epistemological thing. It's helping us to understand that we cannot sustain what is here at the moment. We need to reframe it, to change it. And when you say belonging, it helps me a lot to think about this because we reflect a lot about language and helping people to see that link and actively acting to change. One of the things that usually we also say when an initiative that is so beautiful, we say, this initiative is incredible. It's not, it's credible. So small little things from our language that taught us of not believing what else is possible. So I think you brought this beautifully. I want to bring a conversation now about the sense of place. You mentioned lots of things about how the museum minds the change in its geographic location, Manchester. And of course, it's very important that the community is giving you the ideas of what is degenerated in the area, what needs to be regenerated, and you are identifying and working with them. So I just want to bring here that regenerative development leaders, they believe that regeneration can only happen place by place. There is no such a thing as an ecological good sense of the planet. Everyone can make ecological good sense locally if the affection, the scale, knowledge, tools, and skills are right. This is not my own thinking, it's from Endo Berry. And he says this really beautiful saying that by local, we can change globally. The other quote I want to bring from Regenerative Institute is the ground for regenerative development is an understanding of place. What makes each place unique, what gives you vitality, viability, the source of its potential and its capacity to evolve. With this understanding, it becomes possible to tailor sustainable designs and processes that are harmonious to the character of the place. So I think it's very clear to me the notion that you are supporting the healing of Manchester, maybe, and you can tell me if you feel like this, maybe committed to regenerating what is happening in Manchester geographically. But I want to expand the notion of place when we think about museums. and bring the case of the places that museums represent. You mentioned Panama, the Australian island. So museums may be, maybe the place in museums might not just be the geographic location. It could be, how to say this name, Ani di Incawa. I mean, and the land in Australia, I don't know how to say the name. But let's think about the case of the repatriation that you have done. So do you think museums could help to regenerate the places they represent in their collections? So, for example, when a museum repatriates an object that originally belonged to another place, such as this island, when it gives back, it depends on how this is done. Somehow it can contribute to healing this ecosystem that was broken or unbalanced by the absence of this object. What do you think about this and the role of the curator of living cultures on that facilitation?
Yeah, so, I think a lot about this. I suppose I think first and foremost, it's, right. So I think what I think about this is it has to be led by those communities. So there is I'm just very, you can hear it in my tentative words. I am very mindful. We have to be really careful that we don't end up with some god-awful colonial 2.0 museums sense of we can change everything for the better folks. We're there in our capes, saviours. That is not where I am here at all. So actually, I will draw on experience rather than beyond. If I look at what we have learnt from and what we were told and are told, because the relationship holds with the Anandiliakwa communities, their way of talking about this is the return of these objects, that is the act, has unlocked a rich cultural history. It has unlocked new practices, so new art making practices. It has unlocked new relationships. So very often there's a talk about kind of cultural revitalization. It is about that. But there's something, I think, even more important, which is that ultimately it has given people what they desperately wanted, which is they wanted to care for these belongings. They're absolutely integral to their sense of place, and it has returned that to them. I expect we will always be linked. Always. Manchester and India, we will always be linked because of this, because we have their living cultures in our collections, because we have returned this material. The fact that we were building the relation, all of this is about relationship building, absolutely all of it. And we were building those relationships. They are between individuals. Yes, there's institutional as well. I've got, actually, just because I was talking about somebody yesterday, I've got a really beautiful quote from a colleague of mine, which just gives a flavour, I think. So she's talking from a museum perspective, but I'll explain more from the Anandiliakwa perspective. So she was saying they went. She's called Georgina Young. She's our head of collections, and alongside Njabulo Chipangura, our curator of living cultures, and Alex, our curator of indigenous perspectives, the three of them went to Groot and did some work on the island about building the return request. So she said, what is set on paper as part of a return request, no matter how comprehensive and nuanced, does not replicate embodied understanding. Indeed, our formats and requirements for requests are deliberately designed not to feel like a conversation about kin. They are designed not to encompass the spiritual and the emotional, the lived and the law. This is human work. And that, for me, from a museum, that sits at the heart of it. We are really, really struggling to make more room for the emotional and spiritual. We don't know how to do that. The processes don't enable us very well at the moment. From the Anandiliakwa perspective, their sense is this was not a transaction. That is not what this was. This was a collaboration and a dialogue. Somebody said it was fueled by empathy, trust, and love, which I think we might need more of in our museums. But that ultimately it's about shifting for them what may be possible on their island. So I don't really want to talk anymore for them because I can't, but I suppose that's part of it really, and I think it's about this is really core. It's their relationship to their heritage and practices and their sense of belonging. I know we've had that conversation. Their sense of belonging has been strengthened by the return of that material.
And I think you mentioned the legacy for the museum. It never ends because the collaboration continues. But you mentioned that the whole notion of love, care, and spiritual that contains in this object. It's any other impact and legacy that you feel like this action has left for the Manchester Museum?
Oh, several, yeah. I mean, many. And I suppose part of it is really, there's a fundamental one, which is actually what it set out to do. Was it set out to say, we're going to have a conversation about where this material is best cared for. And it isn't in Manchester. So what does that mean for other material in the museum? So actually, we are doing a whole host of work. We often called collaborative provenance research. My colleague Njabu started to do a lot more work in and across Africa. We're really interested in what that means for building more equitable relationships with those communities and actually framing it in this way around a conversation about the care for those collections becomes it is genuinely a collaboration. And I suppose for me, I don't think people do it as much now, but still people frame repatriation as loss. And I think it is such a fundamental misunderstanding. And I love to think we may be able to conceive of repatriation as a future for our museums. What if that's partly now quite a big part of what we're there to do? What an amazing role we could have in the world. So part of this is actually we're working through what that might mean. And of course, in doing that, you are really you have to have serious conversations about, curatorial humility. What does that look like? Where does the power sit? What is a process of reconciliation? Actually, what's our understanding of what that might be? All of those conversations start to emerge. We're currently working with the Anandili Land Council and lots of partners on their co-curating an exhibition, which will open hopefully later in the year in Manchester, which is them sharing the story in their words, on their terms, of what it's meant for them in their part of the world, because that's what we need to hear. You don't actually need to hear me talk about that. You need to hear them talk about that. Mm-hmm. So that's what that exhibition will be about, the process, but also about what that might mean and about what our visitors therefore might want to think through what that means about the role of museums.
And it's beautiful that decolonization is a topic that is happening in other topics and in other industries, in other areas. It's not just with museums, but there is something unique contribution that museums can give. Absolutely. And this is very much related to the material and immaterial culture. And I think it's interesting to remember that redistributing collections, it's a lot about the notion of the commons. And the notion of the commons, it's very interconnected to this transition of institutions to a new era where we can perhaps think more in a common and collective future for us all. It's very symbolic of this, but it's interesting to remember that this is not happening only with museums, but museums can bring an open mind way and a tangible way of demonstrating this to happen.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add to that, because I think one of the things I found so interesting is how that's resonated within, particularly not just Manchester, but very hyperlocally within an organisation like a university. So, how how does this work? How do we get this through the board? How does all of that work? And it's really simple, because the infrastructure within which it works, it's all about, think about UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That's part of the umbrella that sits above this. That's part of the decision-making process. And actually, the university, their response was incredible. They believe in social responsibility. They were like, this is what a socially responsible museum does. Oh, and we're a university and we're educating the next generation of global citizens. And so actually the context maybe is slightly different within a university, but I think it's one that takes a really good, long, hard look at what social responsibility means, and actually starts to really grapple with both what that means locally, but also globally as well.
And it's beautiful to see you are an university museum, so you probably sit on both intentions of creating knowledge and reframing that knowledge, which is really good. I want to step back and just ask if the museum applies the SDGs framework, so the Sustainable Development Framework, which is the Agenda 2030 of the United Nations. So regenerative thinkers, they understand that sustainable development aims to overcome extractive paradigm, reduce damage. So they're doing more good, less bad, but it still do not embrace decisions that may require degrowth instead of economic growth, as you know, the SDGA. And although its intentions are really good, positive, it's a way to go if you want to build a new future, but then not always prioritize the biosphere health. What is your opinion about this? And also, do you think regenerative lens could inform different ways of looking at sustainable development? Or what are your opinion takes on
it's a really relevant question. So so we are just at the point, and it's a question that I'm not going to be able to answer that well, because so our mission is to build a more sustainable world and understanding between cultures. We are just at the point where we are looking at our next however many years, 20 years, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, who knows, strategy. And one of the things that we've all talked about are the limits. So we are very clearly, we're in a university, there are SDGs, part of the work. The Manchester Museum, before I arrived, did a huge amount of work around SDGs. Actually, when I arrived, whilst it was doing a lot of work with the UN and others, actually said, I want our focus to really be hyperlocal. Doesn't mean we won't do work on the other side of the world, but I really want us to focus in hyperlocally. Actually not so interested in us trying to influence big UN SDGs. In fact, my belief is you do that through working hyperlocally if you wanted to influence beyond. And so actually where we're at is everything you've just said about those sustainable development goals, I think we would agree with. We're just starting to look at what sort of thinking do we need to really move us on. And certainly we've been talking about what does degrowth mean. So that everything from, I've made lots of decisions to stop all sorts of different activity, which on the face of it, actually we were quite dependent on financially. We don't tour internationally anymore. There are all sorts of we've completely changed so many of the products in our shop. We've made some big decisions around this. We've explored actively circular economies in terms of exhibition making. That's absolutely where we're at. And in a way, there's quite a lot of cynicism within the museum about the SDGs from lots of colleagues, but also there is an acknowledgement of the power of doing something which is global. So just being really frank, we are literally right at the heart of that very conversation. And what I love about my colleagues and the wider community is, how do we have that conversation? That's where my energy is going. Who gets involved in that conversation? How do we do that? So we open up that conversation. So we think in public. So I'm as director, not there saying, we think this and it's a hard, fast, we are evolving what our strategy will be. The SDGs, they absolutely are a really important part of the backdrop. We contribute to them in multiple ways. Are they what we are going to hold up as our, where we're heading, what we're trying to achieve? No, I don't think they will be. I'm very interested in how we can expand and challenge and move forward our ambition beyond what those do.
That's really good. I'm going to go to the ICOM AMREC conference. I don't know if you're aware, in July. And I'm going to run the last panel with Robert James, asking exactly what is the next thing we should do to 2030. And later, sustainable development framework. What is the next thing? And we don't know. We are all thinking and reflecting. But I think it's a good question to ask.
It's a great question.
The moment to ask this question is now.
Absolutely. And in a way, I think it's been that for 2 or 3 years for us anyway. For many people, much longer. But certainly for us, it's one we've been really, really grappling with and are still grappling. I think that's as it should be.
Let me tell you that I'm conscious of your time, but I have 2 other questions if I can still make them. Are you okay with this?
Yeah, I am. I've got 10 minutes.
Okay. Let's think about people like you who are actually leading regenerative projects. I want to reflect on the skills, capacities, and qualities are needed for this task. And just to bring just a little bit of reflection, regenerative thinkers believe that for an organization to be regenerative, it requires individuals who are committed to self-development. What Regenesis group says, we must bring our whole selves to the task. We must transform ourselves from despoilers to co-evolvers. To be agents of transformation, designs must transform themselves. And it requires perhaps inner work. I'm not sure if we agree, we can reflect on that. But what I want to ask you is, how can we bring this knowledge to the museums in terms of overcome the barriers, but also looking at opportunities when we think about a more ecological, social capacity to museums professionals, but also inviting them to embark in a more self-development journey that co-evolves with the territory and its change, because it's very dynamic. So what are the skills, capacities, qualities you would say a regenerative leader or someone doing some things you were doing should look for and develop?
Yeah, it's really, I've been thinking a lot about this, and partly because I think there's this real moment that we're in, which is generationally as well, and it's around that notion of bringing your whole self, and actually becomes really challenging around ethics, around politics, and identity, and actually I think we're really in the midst of trying to understand how we navigate that, what's possible, what's not possible within the structures we hold and have. And it's something I feel a very keen tension related to all of that as well. I suppose the bit about the doing work, and I'll only talk about me briefly. So I remember, I can give you the exact moment, but I won't, but I remember really clearly, and it was quite a long time ago, but I remember really clearly when the moment it really dawned on me what was happening to our world environmentally. I mean, it was really grim, and I'm very fortunate. I work with an eco-psychologist who's a coach, and I have a particular practice I have developed. It's a walking practice. I do it monthly, and for me, it's my space to reflect, to go back to. I look over my shoulder over at the museum. I have all sorts of ways of reflecting, and I try to encourage that reflexive culture as much as possible within my organisation. I also, though, think there's something about a level of comfort with vulnerability that is really challenging for many who work in museums. This sort of sense of feeling we should know answers, and actually instead really trying to focus in on actually putting the energy into thinking about how we're creating conditions for questions, for exploration, rather than this sense of us and our collections holding answers. I think that is, it sounds such a simple thing, but I think that is a real shift, actually. And I think the other one really is this real focus and really grappling with what collaboration really means. So, you know, we talk in the museum a lot about a sense of collective endeavour. In fact, there is nothing you'd really do on your own. You know, our Wild exhibition I've just mentioned, there is a curatorial team, there are 6 of them who work on that project, and actually learning those skills around how to collaborate well, around how to value other skill sets, around what you don't know, around being open to development, open to challenge. For me, those are all really, really critical in all of this, and particularly important when, rightly, you then are challenged for what you're not doing, or a position you are not taking, or where you are going too slowly. So I think that kind of, how do we build that in terms of leadership so that people are actively, when there is a criticism, the response is tell me more, not defense. You know, when there is interesting work, there is curiosity and wanting to find who the fellow travelers are, wanting to make those connections. Those for me are a skill set that I think, well, I don't know quite how you do the work if you didn't have them, but I also can see that people really want to be equipped to be able to do this. And if you're not used to working in that way, then actually you need some support to do that. I don't know whether that answers that, but
it's great that you mentioned this, because the way I learned this whole thing, of course, it's all my childhood and everything. I come from the global south, and I have indigenous and African, Brazilian ancestor knowledge, but I learned the proper deep ecology through our eco village. And I remember when I started doing this 7 years ago, I was looking for museums professionals. Where are they? Because it's the interesting way of trying to become vulnerable on things that we don't know in the museum sector. And then where are the sources of information available to think regeneratively? And I start entering into this process. And as you said, it's learning with nature, it's learning by doing, it's very self-reflective. I'm glad you brought the idea of the eco coach and how you have been doing this self-reflection, because it's always about our individual role in a big task, and we go one by one but collectively.
And I think it's also about encouraging people to find what works for them. So I joke with colleagues and say, you know, I'm a gardener, so I joke with colleagues and say, you know, to be frank, I am never more rooted, more myself, stronger, happier, probably better as a human than when I have soil under my fingernails, and when I am really nervous about something, really nervous. So if you came to our reopening, big reopening of the museum, and I have to give this big speech in front of all of these people, I have soil under my fingernails as I'm doing it, because I will give that speech better. Now, some people think that's a bit bonkers. It doesn't matter. Find what works for you and understand where and how you can feel comfortable with not knowing. and then if you can do that, then actually some of the unlearning you might need to do, or the learning you need to do, becomes you know, you have some agency in it. You know, change is bloody hard. It's not so tough if you feel you have some agency there. So that, I think all of that for me is related.
That's really good. So before we finish, I just want your final comments on, I'm very interested in the idea that museums can create a generation of regenerators. We are there just as a means to help people to see how they can regeneratively act in their own places. And I think you touched on this in many examples you gave about the Manchester museum work. But what would be your understanding of the specific contribution that museums can make to the planet's regeneration? If we would say, what is the unique contribution museums can actually give to this main movement and thinking that we just express in this conversation?
It's a really interesting one. I don't think I can give you that one thing. I wish I could. And I think that's because museums are multiple. So, you know, the simple and slightly, slightly lazy answer from me would be stories, you know, or shift the narrative. That's really important. I'm not underestimating how important that is at all. But we are more than just storytellers. We have material culture. We have data. We have the stories. We have the lessons. We have the expertise. We have the ability to convene and bring so many people together. We have the ability to build community, to build aspirations. And I've seen so many examples of where we've done that really beautifully, about things where you would think they have, what's that got to do with the museum? What's the recycling locally got anything to do with the museum? Oh, I promise you it's got quite a lot, actually, because we can host this rubbish night at the museum and bring the residents and the policymakers and the waste professionals together. And actually, we've got collections that are full of what you might conceive of as rubbish. And actually, we can be a space where we can all think through together what we might need for the future. I mean, I'm using a kind of specific example, but I can think of so many of those. And actually, the glory of that, something like that, is it is collections, it is definitely people, it is place, it is all of those. So a bit of me thinks, I don't know what the unique contribution to museums is. I feel I should. I'm a museum director. And in a way, maybe I'm not that interested in what I think that is. I'm interested in what everybody else thinks that is.
And I think you kind of said, how do we write a new story for our planet, for a future of our planet? So stories, based on new stories.
Stories and imagination, you know. I remember talking to someone locally, and they was talking, and actually it's about public health, because I did some work in public health. And I said, you know, what for you could arts and culture and museums really help you with? And I loved their answer. And they just looked at me and they went, oh, our civic imagination. And I thought it was so beautiful. They said, you can just help us imagine a different civic life. And I was just like, yep, I see that. I see that.
It's a beautiful way of finishing the conversation, that it's never ends. It's so beautiful, regeneratively thinking with you. Thank you for your time. Appreciate your contribution to this research. I'm going to update you about the progress of the report when it's going to be released.
Brilliant.
Just to finish, I have been interviewing Esme Ward, the director of the Manchester Museum. I'm Lucimara Letelier, the researcher of Regenerative Museums at the University of Leicester, Museum Studies and Green Museum Specialist. If that's okay, we'll close with this, and really, really thank you.
Pleasure.